In the 1970s, Venezuela stood as a beacon of prosperity in Latin America, boasting the highest GDP per capita in the region and a standard of living that rivaled many developed nations. Fueled by immense oil wealth, Caracas was a city of modern skylines, bustling nightlife, and a growing middle class that enjoyed imported goods, stable jobs, and the promise of upward mobility. The country's vast reserves of petroleum seemed to guarantee endless prosperity, and Venezuela was often referred to as the Saudi Arabia of South America. Yet today, the picture could not be more different. Hyperinflation has rendered its currency nearly worthless. Infrastructure has collapsed, and millions of Venezuelans have fled their homeland in search of survival, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. Supermarkets that once overflowed with goods now stand empty, hospitals lack basic medicines, and protests fill the streets as citizens demand relief from a system that has failed them. The contrast between Venezuela's golden age and its current struggles is stark and heartbreaking, a nation blessed with the world's largest oil reserves has become an economic disaster zone. This story is not just about statistics or policy failures, it is about human lives. Families are torn apart as parents leave to work abroad. Professionals who once thrived now drive taxis in foreign cities, and children grow up in scarcity, their futures clouded by uncertainty. The central question that drives this narrative is simple yet profound. How did Venezuela, a country with every advantage, fall so far? What choices, missteps, and circumstances transformed a land of promise into a cautionary tale of collapse? This is the story of Venezuela's rise and fall, a journey through wealth, populism, corruption, and resilience, and an exploration of whether a nation that has stumbled so deeply can ever reclaim its place among the prosperous. Venezuela's economic journey is one of the most dramatic and cautionary tales of modern history, a story that begins with extraordinary promise and ends in collapse. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century transformed Venezuela from a largely agrarian society into one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. By the mid-century, oil revenues had created a booming economy, funding infrastructure, education, and social programs that lifted millions into the middle class. Caracas became a symbol of modernity, its skyline filled with high-rises, its streets bustling with commerce, and its citizens enjoying imported goods and a standard of living that rivaled many developed countries. For decades, Venezuela was celebrated as the Saudi Arabia of South America, a nation blessed with immense natural wealth and seemingly destined for prosperity. Yet, beneath this glittering surface lay vulnerabilities that would eventually unravel the country's fortunes. Dependence on oil meant that Venezuela's economy rose and fell with global energy prices, and when those prices dropped, the cracks began to show. Political shifts compounded the problem, with populist leaders promising redistribution and social justice, but often financing these promises through unsustainable spending and policies that discouraged investment. Over time, corruption, mismanagement, and authoritarianism eroded the foundations of growth, leaving Venezuela trapped in cycles of crisis. The collapse into economic disaster became most visible in the 21st century, when hyperinflation rendered the currency nearly worthless, infrastructure decayed, and millions of Venezuelans fled their homeland in search of survival. Once a nation of prosperity, Venezuela became synonymous with scarcity, protests, and humanitarian crisis. Supermarkets emptied, hospitals lacked basic medicines, and families were torn apart as migration surged across Latin America, reshaping regional demographics and geopolitics. The contrast between Venezuela's golden age and its present struggles is stark. A country with the world's largest proven oil reserves now suffers one of the worst economic collapses in modern times. This story matters globally because it highlights the dangers of resource dependence, the consequences of populism, and the importance of governance. Venezuela's rise and fall is not just about oil or economics, it is about choices, leadership, and the resilience of people caught in the storm, for nations rich in resources. Venezuela serves as a warning of the resource curse, where wealth from commodities can create complacency, discourage diversification, and foster corruption. It also underscores how populist policies, while appealing in the short term, can undermine long-term stability when they prioritize immediate gains over sustainable planning. Governance plays a central role in this narrative. Strong institutions and transparent leadership can turn resource wealth into lasting prosperity, but weak institutions and corruption can squander even the greatest advantages. The impact of Venezuela's collapse extends beyond its borders, as millions of migrants have reshaped neighboring countries, creating new social and political challenges across Latin America. The crisis has also influenced global geopolitics, with Venezuela's alliances and disputes affecting energy markets, international aid, and diplomatic relations. This video will trace Venezuela's journey in detail, beginning with its rise through oil wealth and the prosperity that defined its golden age. It will then examine the political shifts and populism that reshaped the nation, the economic mismanagement and corruption that eroded its foundations, and the hyperinflation and humanitarian crisis that brought Venezuela to its knees. Finally, it will reflect on the lessons the world can draw from this story, lessons about the importance of diversification, the dangers of populism, and the need for strong governance to sustain prosperity. Venezuela's journey is not just a national tragedy. It is a global lesson in how quickly wealth can turn to ruin when ambition is not matched by discipline, and how resilience alone is not enough without leadership and vision to create lasting change. In the 1970s, Venezuela was a nation that seemed to embody the promise of prosperity in Latin America, a country whose immense oil wealth had elevated it to the highest GDP per capita in the region, and given its citizens a standard of living that rivaled many developed nations. Caracas was a city of gleaming skyscrapers, bustling nightlife, and a thriving middle class that enjoyed imported goods, stable jobs, and the confidence that their future was secure. Venezuela was often described as the Saudi Arabia of South America, blessed with the world's largest proven oil reserves and seemingly destined to remain a global economic powerhouse. Yet, fast forward to today, and the contrast could not be more stark. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar nearly worthless. Supermarkets stand empty, hospitals lack basic medicines, and millions of Venezuelans have fled their homeland in search of survival, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. Families are torn apart as parents leave to work abroad. Professionals who once thrived now drive taxis in foreign cities. And children grow up in scarcity, their futures clouded by uncertainty. The central question that drives this story is simple yet profound. How did a nation blessed with such extraordinary wealth fall so far, transforming from a land of promise into an economic disaster zone? To understand Venezuela's collapse, we must trace its economic journey from the discovery of oil in the early 20th century to the boom, years that created prosperity and a vibrant middle class, and then to the political shifts and populist policies that reshaped the nation's trajectory. But oil revenues once funded infrastructure, education, and social programs, lifting millions out of poverty and giving Venezuela global prestige.
But dependence on oil also created vulnerabilities, as agriculture and manufacturing were neglected, and the economy became tied to the fluctuations of global energy prices. When oil prices fell, the cracks began to show, and political leaders responded with populist measures that won votes but undermined sustainability. The rise of Hugo Chavez in 1999 marked a turning point, as the Bolivarian Revolution promised redistribution and social justice, but relied on subsidies, price controls, and nationalization that discouraged investment and fostered inefficiency. Over time, corruption and mismanagement hollowed out the state oil company PDVSA. Billions were lost, and infrastructure decayed despite the country's immense wealth. The collapse became undeniable in the 21st century. When oil prices plummeted in 2014, revenues evaporated, exposing the fragility of Venezuela's dependence on a single resource. Currency controls created black markets, the bolivar lost credibility, and parallel exchange rates emerged as citizens scrambled to preserve value. By 2016, hyperinflation gripped the nation, with prices doubling weekly and the IMF estimating inflation in the millions of %. Public services collapsed, hospitals ran out of medicine, schools lacked supplies, and ordinary life became a daily struggle for survival. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled, the largest migration crisis in Latin American history, reshaping the region and straining neighboring countries. The human toll was immense, professionals reduced to menial jobs abroad, families separated across borders, and children malnourished in a country that once prided itself on abundance. This story matters globally because Venezuela's rise and fall is not just about economics, it is about choices, governance, and resilience. It highlights the dangers of the resource curse, where dependence on commodities creates vulnerability, and the risks of populism, where policies that win votes can destroy long-term sustainability. It underscores the importance of strong institutions, transparency, and consistent policy as safeguards against collapse. The lessons extend far beyond Venezuela, offering warnings to other resource-rich nations about the need to diversify, plan for the long term, and resist the temptations of short-term populism. The impact of Venezuela's crisis also reverberates across Latin America and the world, reshaping migration patterns, influencing geopolitics, and serving as a reminder of how quickly prosperity can unravel when governance fails. This video will trace Venezuela's journey in detail, beginning with its rise through oil wealth and the prosperity that defined its golden age. It will then examine the political shifts and populism that reshaped the nation, the economic mismanagement and corruption that eroded its foundations, and the hyperinflation and humanitarian crisis that brought Venezuela to its knees. Finally, it will reflect on the lessons the world can draw from this story, lessons about the importance of diversification, the dangers of populism, and the need for strong governance to sustain prosperity. Venezuela's journey is not just a national tragedy. It is a global lesson in how quickly wealth can turn to ruin when ambition is not matched by discipline, and how resilience alone is not enough without leadership and vision to create lasting change. Venezuela's economic journey is one of the most striking narratives of modern history, a story that begins with dazzling prosperity and ends in collapse. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela stood as a symbol of wealth in Latin America, blessed with the world's largest proven oil reserves and elevated by revenues that funded infrastructure, education, and social programs. Caracas was a modern capital, its skyline filled with high-rises, its streets alive with commerce, and its citizens enjoying a standard of living that rivaled many developed nations. Oil wealth created a thriving middle class, consumer culture flourished, and Venezuela was often described as the Saudi Arabia of South America. Yet, beneath this golden age lay vulnerabilities that would eventually unravel the nation's fortunes. Dependence on oil meant that prosperity was tied to global energy prices, and when those prices fell, the cracks began to show. Political shifts and populist policies compounded the problem, with leaders promising redistribution and social justice, but financing these promises through unsustainable spending and policies that discouraged investment. Over time, corruption, mismanagement, and authoritarianism eroded the foundations of growth, leaving Venezuela trapped in cycles of crisis. The collapse became undeniable in the 21st century. Hyperinflation gripped the nation, rendering the bolivar nearly worthless and forcing families to spend their wages immediately before prices doubled again. Public services crumbled, hospitals ran out of medicine, schools lacked supplies, and infrastructure decayed despite the country's immense wealth. Millions of Venezuelans fled their homeland, creating one of the largest migration crises in Latin American history, reshaping demographics and straining neighboring countries. Professionals who once thrived were reduced to menial jobs abroad, families were separated across borders, and children grew up in scarcity, their futures clouded by uncertainty. Venezuela's journey from oil-rich prosperity to economic collapse is not just about statistics or policy failures. It is about human lives, about the resilience of people caught in a storm, and about the consequences of choices made by leaders over decades. The reflective takeaway from this story is clear. Venezuela's decline is not simply an economic tragedy, it is a lesson in choices, leadership, and resilience. Choices made in pursuit of short-term popularity undermine long-term sustainability. Leadership that embraced populism delivered immediate benefits, but sacrificed stability. Weak institutions and corruption eroded trust, leaving citizens skeptical of promises of reform. Yet resilience has remained a defining feature of the Venezuelan people, who have endured repeated crises with determination, adapting to uncertainty and demanding accountability from their leaders. Venezuela's story reminds us that prosperity is fragile, that institutions matter as much as resources, and that without consistent policy and long-term planning, even the wealthiest nations can stumble. The thought-provoking question that lingers is whether Venezuela can rise again. Can it break free from the cycles of inflation, debt, and instability that have defined its modern history? Can it build institutions strong enough to resist corruption and political volatility, and policies consistent enough to inspire confidence at home and abroad? Venezuela's past shows both the heights of success and the depths of crisis, and its future depends on whether it can learn from these lessons. For the world, Venezuela's story serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that resources, and early prosperity are not guarantees of lasting success, and that governance, discipline, and foresight are essential to sustain growth. As we reflect on Venezuela's journey, we are left with a question that resonates far beyond its borders. Will Venezuela reclaim its place as a prosperous nation, or will it remain a symbol of squandered potential and a warning to others? The answer lies not only in economics but in the choices of leaders and the resilience of its people, and it is a story still being written. For viewers, the call to action is to consider what lessons their own countries can learn from Venezuela's experience. Every nation faces the temptation of populism, the challenge of balancing growth with sustainability, and the need to build strong institutions that can withstand shocks. Venezuela's journey is ultimately a reminder that ambition must be matched by discipline, resilience must be supported by governance, and the lessons of history must be heeded if nations are to avoid repeating the same mistakes.